Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a little bit closer look at the image quality from the new Laowa. This is the 15mm f2 0D lens for Sony E-mount. Now, in my first episode, I broke down the build quality and the general design from this lens, and so I would encourage you to use that as a starting point. But today we're going to dig a little bit deeper, and we're going to look at various aspects of the image quality from this lens. And so, recognizing in particular that Laowa is a newer brand on the market, and so you may have some questions on how it's actually going to perform. So I hope to demonstrate that for you here today. So we're going to take a look at a number of images here. We're going to look at things like the resolution from the lens. We will look at distortion, things like vignette, also flare resistance, chromatic aberration, all of these different things. And towards the end, we'll even look at the Coma Performance from this lens, because it certainly is a, with that, wide focal length along with a wide maximum aperture of f2, it does make it a compelling option for shooting the night sky. So let's take a look together at all these things and see what conclusions we come to. Okay, the first thing I want to do is just give you a quick look at how Vignette impacts the image here. And so we're going to see that Vignette certainly is an issue. So note also, because there are no electronic contacts, that the aperture information is not transmitted. What I've done is just used full stops here. So here's f2. At f2.8, you can see that there is some lifting around the corners. f4, I would say, shows an even bigger improvement. f5.6, you can see that shadows still lift at that point. And then even moving to f8, we see a mild improvement there as well. And so certainly there is, Vignette is pretty much an issue at any usable aperture, and unfortunately you're not going to have a standard profile in camera to correct for this. So JPEGs, it will be an issue, and RAW, you're going to have to deal with that in post. Now back at f2, let's take a look at our image quality here. And so looking at the center of the frame, we can see that image quality is, there is some resolution there at f2. I would consider this to be a usable result. But at the same time, there's certainly some veiling that's there, lack of contrast, that, there's not a lot of bite to the image. Now, as we move out towards the edge of the frame, what I'm finding here is that while there is a little bit of loss of actual resolution towards the edge, it's really not all that significant. And so in relation to the center, there is a fairly even sharpness profile here across the edge. One thing that you can note is that there is some green fringing here along the edges of this, and that is the result of some lateral chromatic aberration that is showing up there, and so that's just also something to watch for. Now here, moving down to f2.8, I'll give you a quick look just here natively at it, and you may not be able to visualize how significant the change is, so I'm going to put these side by side. So f2 here on the left, now f2.8 on the right, and you can see that there is a huge difference between f2 and f2.8. And so while image quality might be considered usable here, it's certainly vastly improved at f2.8. Less dramatic advantage here towards the edge of the frame, and that's because we've already seen that the sharpness profile is fairly even, and so there's a mild improvement here. Some of that's due to a little bit of lifted vignette. And there is probably a little bit of contrast improvement here, but really the most significant improvement is in the center. You will note that that green fringing is still visible and still there, and that's because lateral chromatic aberration is not really all that impacted by aperture, unlike axial or longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is very much aperture specific. So if we stop on down to f5.6, we're going to find that we certainly, just looking at them globally, you're going to get a much more even result. So obviously, if you're wanting to shoot landscape here and you don't need, a bigger aperture for collecting light, f5.6 is probably going to be pretty much on the A7R III, which I'm testing. It seems to be pretty much an optimal aperture for getting, your shadows lifted along the edge, but also getting more resolution. Now, at this stage, again, the advantage here in the corner of the frame is far less noticeable. It's really more, again, a lift of vignette more than it is any kind of true resolution or contrast bump. And so most of those gains are going to be realized, you know, more towards the center of the frame. And as you go further out, you'll see that what advantage is there is kind of diminishing a fair bit. So just to give you a visual comparison here, I've put up the Tamron 15 to 30 millimeter f2.8 on the left here at 15 millimeters compared to the Laowa 15mm f2 here on the right. I've used the Sigma MC11 adapter for the Tamron, and of course the MC11 adapter, it really just provides spacing. There's no glass, no optics in it. It's just air and electronic contacts, and so it doesn't negatively impact image quality. A few things to note globally here. First of all, as far as the framing goes, they're not lined up completely identically, but I do think that the Laowa is a little bit wider from what I can tell, and you can see certainly a lot more extra here compared to this side on the Tamron than, you know, any advantage that the Tamron has in width on this side. And so unsurprisingly here, the Laowa Prime is the wider lens of the two. And so other thing to note here, of course, is that the Tamron, even though it's wide open compared to the Laowa being stopped down a stop, it does show less vignette here along the side of the frame. But of course, the big thing that stands out to me is that, you know, the tripod was in an identical position for both of these shots. You can see a huge difference in the amount of distortion, or the lack thereof, in the Laowa, which shows very minimal amounts of distortion without any kind of correction, compared to the Tamron here, which shows the pretty typical, you know, bulging effect of barrel distortion. And so certainly you can see Laowa's claim towards, you know, zero distortion. Zero may be a mild exaggeration, you know, but compared to a true competitor here, certainly there is a huge advantage when it comes to distortion. Now, if we look towards the center of the frame, you know, it becomes quickly obvious here that a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you can see in the very difference in the framing here of these lines that the Tamron is actually having a higher magnification, which means that it's framing tighter, which means it's less than 15 millimeters compared to the 15 millimeters of the Laowa. Beyond that, however, you can also see that the Tamron has a pretty huge advantage when it comes to the amount of resolution and contrast that is visible here compared to the Laowa on the left side. And so I mean, it's just obvious wherever I'm looking here. Of course, the Tamron is a strong performer. Now, if we get off to the very edge of the frame, that advantage is pretty much lost and marginalized. And so anyway, I think that there might be the mildest amount of advantage for the Tamron, but there's not much of it there. By the way, you can also see here, you know, comparing the Laowa image to the Tamron's image, you can see that the Tamron also does have a little bit of that lateral chromatic aberration as well. This is something that they're fairly similar on when it comes to that. Tamron image is a little bit brighter, you know, due to having a little bit less vignette, but other than that, the significant difference is in the center of the frame. And once you get out to the very edge of the frame, that advantage diminishes. Although we do see moving kind of upwards, that it's more the edges of the frame on either side. The top actually looks pretty good on the Tamron by comparison. Now, if we can compare the f5.6 result, we're going to make a couple of observations. Number one, light transmission is obviously superior on the prime lens, with both of them having equal settings, 1/200th of a second, f5.6, true for both of them. Certainly there is a more kind of, you know, just greater brightness, certainly in the center of the frame. Tamron may be a little bit more even in its illumination here than what the Laowa is, which seems to be a little bit maybe darker in the corners by comparison, but overall there's definitely more light transmission that's taking place there. Looking at the center of the frame, we see that the Laowa has closed that gap a fair bit. The Tamron still looks great, and it probably looks a hair better, but they're both within the same kind of margin of error at the center of the frame. Moving down, however, or moving up in the center of the frame, the Tamron looks a little bit better. The Laowa is just a little bit less sharp in that setting. Moving up towards the top, we see a similar truth. The Tamron looks a little bit better. Moving off to the sides of the frame, we also see that the Tamron is better on the sides. It just follows a more traditional pattern that when it's stopped down, that the sharpness profile moves out towards the edges of the frame. And so at traditional landscape apertures, the Tamron is very sharp, and we're going to see that it's more consistent here than what the Laowa is. Now, one thing that I've noted that I consider a little bit of a negative is that sometimes when you have a scene like this, which of course this time of year, this is pretty much all the scenes that I have, lots of snow. And so snow like this tends to show off any kind of odd color cast a little bit. And so what we do see is that there's a little bit of a tendency towards a kind of a bluish green tinge to images off the Laowa. And I saw this also with the 12mm f2.8. And so say if I try to lift that vignette, if you'll note here in the corners and edges, I'm getting a little bit of a kind of a bluish effect, bluish green, that is a little bit odd to me. So here if we put the Tamron on there, you can see maybe what I'm talking about. Of course, the Tamron doesn't suffer from a vignette the same way. And but here with kind of center exposure value, and yes, I recognize there's a little bit of difference in exposure value, and I will show you the Tamron at 1/1250th. Our center exposure value is very close to the same on these two images, which is why I'm using this exposure value here. But as you can see, the difference, with identical settings on the camera, you can see just the difference in the kind of rendering, which is much more neutral from the Tamron lens than it is from the Laowa, that does show a little bit of this color cast. So I'll show you the Tamron image with it also, with it showing the same shutter speed. So here with both of them with the kind of identical settings, you can see that the Tamron image is a little bit more underexposed by comparison. And so you can see, like if we look in this area here, that its light transmission is not as good. Now, beyond that, of course, so this image ends up favoring the Laowa somewhat, and we can see that the Laowa is nice and sharp in the center, and this is at f5.6. We can also see that lateral chromatic aberration that affects both of these. It's a little bit more pronounced on the Laowa than it is on the Tamron, but certainly both of them suffer from it a bit. Now, one trait I have found of Laowa wide-angle lenses is that I find that the color profile of the lenses, and I've shot them now on both Canon and Sony bodies, so it's less about the camera system and more about the kind of the nature of the lenses, is that I find that there is, the colors are a little bit lifeless without kind of boosting them up. And so in this case, we've got a mild underexposure here. And so if we kind of correct for that, you see a little bit of improvement in color, but it's still, colors don't like pop as they do with some. Now, with a little bit of editing here, and this is very mild editing. I mean, I've brought up color saturations and I think maybe produced a more lively result. And so certainly you can get beautiful results out of the Laowa with a little bit of post-processing. But if you purchase this lens, just note that you're going to have to learn how to kind of utilize it to its strengths. Now, using the lens kind of at optimal apertures, this is an unedited shot here. And so one thing I do want to show you is that, even on the very demanding 42 megapixel sensor of the A7R3, you can see that it's providing lots of resolution here, particularly towards the center of the frame, where even at a pixel level, there's lots of detail there, even though the subjects are occupying a pretty small amount of the frame. And here, of course, color looks fine. It's not the most colorful time of year anyway, and so I bear that in mind. Here's another scene here where I've done some very mild processing too. But as you can see, there's a lot of detail there, and so much so you can actually see the snow that's falling some in this scene, and you can even catch it here along the edges. So here across the frame, this is again 42 megapixels. We've got usable detail all throughout here, And so there's, you know, at typical landscape apertures, I'm perfectly satisfied with the amount of resolution I'm getting from the lens. Now, one great strength of the lens is in its ability to resist flare. And so this is actually from a video, so I've just screenshot here. This is wide open at f2. You can see we have a very mild ghosting pattern here, but not at all disruptive to the image. We really don't have a lot of haze or veiling there, and so I consider that a strong result. And here, stop down to f11. Number one, we've got a very nice looking kind of sunburst effect from the lens. And also, you know, there hasn't, sometimes when you stop a lens down, the kind of ghosting artifacts become more pronounced. And I'm not really seeing that here, so this is a really strong performance there. So finally, what about Coma Performance? And so here is, when I did the Laowa 12mm or f2.8, I found that it definitely exhibited some coma, and you know, kind of the upside was that because it was sharp and such a wide focal length, that the coma, while it was there at a pixel level, it wasn't overly obvious. So we're going to see that that's somewhat true here, maybe to a little bit lesser extent. And so towards the center of the frame, you know, we've got nice crisp star points here. But as we start to drift off towards the edge, as you can see with the brighter points, we start to see some of that coma effect. And of course, the further out here you get, the more like kind of flying birds the stars are starting to become. And, you know, for example, in this star cluster here, it looks like a flock of migrating ducks or something that are taking off. So if we compare this result from the Laowa to the Tamron, you can see that the Tamron is, the star points there are stretching a little bit, kind of maybe becoming a little more wedge shape, but certainly, you know, a less obvious kind of result than the Laowa that definitely exhibits more coma in that particular area there. And, you know, as we move towards the edge of the frame, you know, once again, the Tamron, at worst, it's stretching, but here we definitely see the kind of the winged insects or birds effect that come from a more pronounced coma. Of course, the final word on this, here's one that I've done just a little bit of processing to make it pop a little more. You can see that while that coma is there, if you're looking at it at this kind of viewing level, you're not going to necessarily see it. And what you do see is lots of star points and a nice crisp result there. And so, I mean, I would, if I own this lens, I certainly would use it for this result, even though if you're looking at a pixel level, you can certainly see that, you know, the coma is there, but it's not hugely pronounced looking at it at a global level. And so, as you can see, the Laowa 15mm f2 is a little bit of a mixed bag in some ways. It offers good, if not exceptional, resolution that improves somewhat when stopping down, but not to the same degree as, say, the Tamron 15 to 30mm that we saw. On the flip side of that, however, we saw that it has superior flare resistance, and that's an area of some weakness for the Tamron. Another weakness for the Tamron is that, you know, you cannot use traditional filters on it, whereas on the Laowa, this lens hood is removable, and so you can use standard filters in a pretty common 72mm size, and so that's an advantage there. Certainly while the claim of having zero distortion may be slightly exaggerated, certainly there are very few alternatives that are going to offer as low a barrel distortion as what this lens does. So that low distortion, of course, makes it a very attractive option for those of you that are considering shooting architecture or shooting interiors, perhaps for real estate photography. And certainly it helps in other aspects. I mean, even if you're just shooting, for example, weddings in churches and you're looking for a wider angle of view. The compact size is also, I think, a serious asset in that it certainly is a better mount for, say, the Sony a7R Mark III that I have been reviewing it on for that. And so that's an advantage. And then finally, I'm not aware of another alternative in a Sony E mount that has at this focal length, that has a wide of maximum aperture. And while we saw that the image quality is a little bit softer and less contrasty at f2, it certainly is still usable and has applications. And so I consider that to be a positive as well. And so hopefully this will help you in making some decisions about this lens. And if you'll stay tuned, I will be coming back shortly with my final review of the lens itself. And so I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, I do have an ongoing image gallery where you can see a lot of different images there. And of course, you can follow me on social media, become a patron, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.